The morning of March 21st, 1556, dawned cold and grey over Oxford. Crowds gathered in St. Mary's Church, their whispers filling the stone hall as they awaited the final humiliation of a man who had once stood at the very height of power. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the architect of the English Reformation, was about to be paraded before them not in triumph, but in disgrace. For months he had languished in prison, broken down by threats, interrogations, and the relentless machinery of Queen Mary's Catholic restoration. He had signed documents recanting his Protestant faith, admitting to heresy, swearing allegiance once more to Rome. His enemies expected submission. What they did not expect was that this frail, aging man was about to defy them in a way so shocking that his final act would echo for centuries. Cranmer had risen higher than almost any churchman of his time. Born in 1489 to a modest family in Nottinghamshire, he found his path in study and scholarship. At Cambridge, he immersed himself in theology, becoming a figure of quiet intellect and rigorous discipline. Yet his life changed not through books alone, but through history's turning tides. When King Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, it was Cranmer who suggested that Scripture, not papal decree, could decide such matters. The king seized upon the idea. From that moment, Cranmer's fate was bound to the English crown. In 1533, Cranmer was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest clerical post in the realm. With Henry's support, he declared the king's marriage to Catherine void and recognized in Boleyn as queen. More than that, he helped lay the foundations of a church independent of Rome. Cranmer oversaw reforms, promoted the English Bible, and most famously, authored the Book of Common Prayer, a text that would shape the language and worship of England for generations. But the favor of kings is fickle. Cranmer survived Henry's wrath, even after the fall of Boleyn, and remained influential under Henry's young son, Edward VI. Yet when Edward died in 1553, the throne passed to Mary Tudor, Henry's Catholic daughter, remembered by history as Bloody Mary. For Cranmer, the Queen's rise meant doom. Mary saw him not only as a heretic, but as a personal enemy. He had annulled her mother's marriage and stripped the Church of its allegiance to the Pope. Under her reign, England turned back to Rome, and Protestant leaders were arrested, tried, and burned. Cranmer, once the highest prelate of the land, was dragged in chains to face trial for treason and heresy. The proceedings were brutal. His enemies, eager to see him destroyed, demanded that he denounce all he had built. In prison, he was worn down by cold, hunger, and fear. Time and again, he was urged to sign recantations, admitting that he had been wrong, that the Pope was God's true vicar, that his reforms had been heresy. At first he resisted, but the pressure grew unbearable. His will faltered. Piece by piece, signature by signature, Cranmer gave way. He recanted his Protestant faith and begged forgiveness. For Queen Mary and her bishops, this was a triumph. Here was the greatest architect of heresy in England, reduced to confessing his errors. His public degradation was planned with care. He was to read his recantation aloud before the people, to serve as living proof that Protestant defiance could be broken. His death would then follow not swift, but by fire, the Church's chosen punishment for heresy. On that March morning, Cranmer was led into St. Mary's Church, a frail, stooped figure. He had once been the voice of reform, but now his enemies saw only a broken old man, trembling in disgrace. The crowd expected to hear him read the words of his submission, confessing his sins, affirming the Pope, renouncing all that he had once stood for. Instead, as he mounted the pulpit, something changed. His voice, weak at first, grew strong. He admitted that he had indeed written recantations, but then he denounced them. He declared that his true crime was not heresy, but cowardice. He confessed that he had betrayed his faith by citing lies under fear of death. And then, in words that shocked everyone present, he announced that when the fire was lit, the first part of his body to burn would be the very hand that had betrayed him. Gasps spread through the church. The guards moved to silence him. But it was too late. Cranmer had turned his public humiliation into an act of defiance. He was dragged from the pulpit and carried to the stake that awaited him outside. The pyre stood ready on Broad Street. The crowd pressed close, eager to witness the fall of the man who had once commanded the Church of England. Cranmer was bound tightly to the wood, the ropes biting into his arms and chest. The executioner piled the faggots high around him. But as the torch was set to the kindling, Cranmer thrust his right hand forward, the hand that had signed the recantations, and held it steady in the flames. Witnesses recalled the shocking sight. The fire caught his hand, blackening the flesh, and Cranmer held it firm, refusing to withdraw. "This hand hath offended," he cried, "this unworthy right hand." His voice carried above the roar of the fire, as his body burned, as the smoke curled around him. The flames spread higher, engulfing his arms, his chest, his face. Still he stood fast, his hands stretched out in defiance, his lips moving in prayer. The crowd, expecting weakness, instead saw a man transformed in the moment of death. His courage was so fierce, his final act so resolute, that even his enemies were shaken. Cranmer's body was reduced to ash, but his final gesture could not be erased. When the flames died away, there was nothing left of Thomas Cranmer but ashes scattered on the stones of Oxford. His enemies had hoped his death would close a chapter, erasing the man who had torn England from Rome, but the fire that consumed him only set his memory ablaze. His last defiance, his hand in the flames, his voice declaring his faith, turned what should have been a moment of shame into an immortal act of courage. The news spread quickly. Those who had doubted him, who believed he had betrayed his cause by signing recantations, were astonished. Instead of dying in disgrace, he had died in triumph. His final testimony stronger than any sermon he had ever preached. The authorities wanted obedience. What they created was a martyr. Cranmer's death joined that of Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, two Protestant bishops burned at the stake in Oxford just months before. Together, the three executions became legendary, remembered as the Oxford martyrs. Latimer had cried to Ridley as the fire was lit, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by Goddess grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." Cranmer's death added fuel to the candle, his burning hand forever engraved in Protestant memory. For Queen Mary, the campaign of fire was meant to restore Catholic power. Hundreds of men and women were burned during her reign, earning her the name that would follow her through history, Bloody Mary. But these public spectacles often had the opposite effect. The sight of men and women singing hymns in the flames, refusing to break even in agony, shocked onlookers. Instead of strengthening loyalty to Rome, it hardened sympathy for the martyrs and turned hearts toward the Protestant cause. Cranmer's legacy lived on long after the ashes cooled. His Book of Common Prayer survived, treasured in secret during Mary's reign and restored under her Protestant successor, Elizabeth I. Its words solemn, rhythmic, unforgettable shaped English worship and the English language itself. Even today, phrases Cranmer wrote echo in ceremonies, prayers, and hymns across the world. He had sought to give the English people a voice in their faith, and though his body perished in fire, his words endured like stone. The story of his final defiance became central to Protestant identity. Here was a man who had faltered, who had given in to fear, and yet in the moment of truth reclaimed his faith with absolute courage. His burning hand was not only an image of judgment upon himself, but a lesson for all who wavered, that even the weak could find strength in the fire. His death proved that martyrdom was not only for the unyielding saints, but for flawed, human men who rose to greatness in their last breath. The Catholic authorities tried to suppress this narrative, but the Protestant chroniclers preserved it in John Fox's Book of Martyrs. Cranmer's death was immortalized as one of the most powerful examples of faith tested by flame. For generations, English Protestants grew up reading of his courage, seeing him not as a traitor who bent under pressure, but as a man who triumphed in the end. Today, on the very street where Cranmer burned, a cross set into the cobblestones marks the spot. Nearby, the martyr's memorial rises high, a reminder of the price that was paid in fire for England's faith. Tourists and students pass by, often unaware that beneath their feet lay the place where flesh and belief met in smoke. But for those who know, it is sacred ground, a place where history burned itself into memory. Cranmer's death reveals not only the brutality of the age, but the strange alchemy of martyrdom. Burning alive was meant to degrade, to terrorize, to reduce a man to ashes before the eyes of all. Yet in some cases, as with Jan Hus, Giordano Bruno, and Thomas Cranmer, the flames purified rather than destroyed. They turned frailty into legend, weakness into strength. The fire that consumed Cranmer as flesh gave birth to a story that even centuries cannot extinguish. Imagine the scene again, the gray sky over Oxford, the crowd pressing forward, the crackling of wood, and there, in the center of the fire, a withered old man stretching out his hand into the flames, declaring, "This hand hath offended." That hand, blackened and burning, remains one of the most enduring images of the English Reformation. The Church of Rome had won a battle the day Cranmer was dead, his reforms seemingly erased. But in truth, they had lost something greater. By killing him, they had made him unforgettable. His martyrdom would inspire countless others. His words would outlive his enemies, and his story would be retold as long as people remembered the struggle between faith and fear. Thomas Cranmer's end was brutal, agonizing, and unforgettable. A man once broken by fear rose in his last hour to stand taller than his executioners could have imagined. His ashes scattered in Oxford, but his defiance burned into the heart of a nation. This was the martyrdom of Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop, Reformer, heretic, and hero. If this story gripped you and you want to hear more tales of torture, executions, and the darkest punishments in history, subscribe to Torture's Rooms. Each week, we uncover the flames, the blades, and the chains that shape the past, stories of agony and defiance that reveal the true cost of power. Because in history's darkest rooms, the fire never truly goes out.